Live from the Panera Studios, it's the Reading with Robin show, brought to you each week by my friends at Panera Bread, where it's food as it should be. It's where I go to begin my day. There's nothing like that first cup of coffee in the morning. It's also where I go to meet up with friends, and sometimes I even run into a book club. Panera is the perfect place to host a meeting. Everyone's happy with their extensive menu, from the delicious soups and salads to the sandwiches and flatbreads. And don't forget the takeout. The summer months are coming, and who wants to cook? You can order ahead, and your dinner will be waiting for you. That's all at your local Panera Bread. And now, enjoy the show.
It is actually impossible for me to believe, but this is the first time I'm having the opportunity to interview Peter Kramer. His book is out in paperback today, Ordinarily Well, The Case for Antidepressants. Peter is also a Rhode Islander. Again, just amazing. He's a psychiatrist, writer, Brown Medical School professor, and his books Against Depression, Should You Leave, and the New York Times bestselling Listening to Prozac are all books we're familiar with. His articles and book reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Slate, and everywhere. Welcome to Reading with Robin, Peter.
Thank you.
Really is amazing on so many levels, and I'm thrilled. When I saw this was out in paperback today, Ordinarily Well, I thought, if not now, when? And I can't believe that Listening to Prozac is as old as it is. Can you believe that?
No, it implies I might be older, too.
Well, there's that, but, that's the part where the years just... everybody says it, and it's one of those true things, but when I was looking around and thinking about how meaningful that book was in so many ways, and the title's been used in so many ways, and people have really just connected with that, and I thought, how is that the 90s? It's just crazy.
Yeah. Well, it's good news, bad news in psychiatry, because really there have not been breakthroughs since then. Long time without breakthroughs. I think there's some reasons why. The good news is that these medicines, Prozac and the, wannabes and some of the earlier ones, really treat depression, which is something human beings have wanted to do forever, to treat depression with medicines. And, we got that capability in the late 1950s, and I think made it much easier to treat depression then in the 90s with Prozac and Zoloft and Lexapro, whatever, the follow-on drugs.
So that's the thing, like good news, bad news. So you say, what has changed since writing, listening to Prozac, and where we are and mental health in the general conversation?
Right.
I think of all the celebrities that are coming out and really trying to share their experiences and make it, certainly less of a stigma, and Mental Health Month was just last month and all this. Right. And still sometimes when I hear that, these conversations, I think, is that where we still are? And so what are your feelings about that, and where are we headed?
No, I think in the 90s there really was an opening up, and maybe starting in the late 80s, of speaking aloud about depression. And every generation had its book about depression or manic depression going back really hundreds of years. I did a roundup review for the New York Times in the 90s about sort of the history of these memoirs of depression. But with William Styron's Darkness Visible, and then I think also listening to Prozac helped us along, there were just, dozens of memoirs of mood disorder.
Oh, yeah.
So that there was, I think, less stigma, and I think more people coming for treatment. I think with the medicines being a little easier to tolerate, people who were not interested in psychotherapy, weren't likely to believe in psychotherapy, would come and consult for depression. The medicines were easier to use, so the internists, the family doctors, gynecologists were using them more. So, yes, I think that we became much more willing to have our depressions treated as doctors, willing to treat depression starting about then. But as I say, there just haven't been major new kinds of ways of treating depression, except around the edges. For very serious depression, there are different ways of using magnets and electricity and so on, and some experimental uses of drugs like ketamine. But it's been a long time of treading water.
So then we must be due for a breakthrough, right?
Well, I think we may be. The field has some obstacles. I think the drug companies had their hands on the scale for a while. They got caught. They pulled back from research. So there just isn't the big drug company money in research for mental illness in general, which is too bad. When Tom Insel was head of NIMH, he complained about that. I think there's a lot of sort of garage band research. So there's really interesting scientific research about tweaking DNA and RNA and, our gut biome and, lots of interesting approaches to treating depression. I think we may get some breakthroughs, but the funding is sort of scant at the moment.
That's interesting. It always comes back to that somehow, and it would seem that so much money was poured into research and promotion of drugs and all of this. Really didn't think about the fact that the money isn't there. It's not something, I'd be aware of. And the conversation, like you say, people are coming for treatment. But do you think there's any more openness, maybe within certain circles, but just in general?
I think it's within certain circles. Whenever they do these surveys, there are complaints that antidepressants are given to lots of people who don't have a formal diagnosis. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't some problem that antidepressants can treat in Ordinarily Well. I have a chapter where I show two different ways scientists have analyzed that population data to see whether people are being undertreated or overtreated. But whatever the survey, there are always large numbers of people with very serious depression who haven't had even one serious course of medication or psychotherapy. By the way, going back to the other problem of why drug companies have withdrawn their funding, to some extent this field is a victim of its success. There are lots of complaints. I wrote Ordinarily Well because of the sort of popular press writing that these antidepressants are a little better than placebos.
I want to talk about that.
Don't work for mild or moderate major depression. But actually, these medicines work so well that when the FDA challenges drug companies and says, well, if you want to bring a drug to the market, we'd like to see it do better than Zoloft or Prozac. It's actually pretty hard to do better than Zoloft or Prozac. They do pretty well.
And also back to the formal diagnosis or people that are, and I've often thought of this, where people, if you just sort of gave everybody, you wouldn't, Prozac or Zoloft or whatever to try, there would be marketable differences. And then so that becomes such a tricky thing to me. And this is very different than talking about severe depression or other illnesses.
That was the premise of listening to Prozac, was that these medicines seem to tweak people's personalities so that it might be that even if you didn't have depression, say if you just had some liability but had never been depressed and you were put on one of these medicines, you might find you were more comfortable socially, more assertive, and less inhibited. And so that these medicines were doing some of the work of psychotherapy, it looked like. Certainly in depressed people, they were and are. And I review that again Ordinarily Well. The updated research shows that when people who are depressed are treated with antidepressants, they seem to do better in terms of personality traits that the culture rewards, whether or not they get fully better from the depression. These medicines seem to have real personality effects. So, you couldn't just give someone a medicine and if that person reported improvements, conclude that that person had been depressed. You really need to diagnose depression independently. And again, listening to Prozac was about the sort of ethics and risks to the culture of having these medicines to hand, where they're going to get us to prescribe for things that ordinarily we wouldn't have prescribed for. Ordinarily Well is really the other side of the problem, which is when people have very serious depression, how much do we trust the remedies that we have to hand?
It's such a fascinating topic, and I also remember thinking, it's all sort of the 90s are sort of flooding back to me as I'm speaking to you, because everybody was talking about that and wanting to try it, and let's just see what happens, and it marks such a space in time. And
by the way, I don't think it happened. I don't think these medicines really were given out promiscuously and more.
Maybe it was a circle. I'm talking about a limited circle.
Talked about it, and in the way that everybody talked about psychoanalysis, but probably not that many people really underwent psychoanalysis. From the 30s to the 60s. I think, in the 90s that became the early drugs, Prozac, Zoloft, a little later Celexa, and people would talk about them at cocktail parties. But I have a pretty good overview of this because my practice, which is in Providence, Rhode Island, became more and more people were interested in treatment for depression because I'd written about it, or minor mood disorders. And then I got lots of phone calls, and when it became more popular, emails. And I really did not run into a single case of someone taking Prozac to improve his, get past writer's block, whatever.
Well, we can talk off air. I remember this. It was kind of like people popping Viagra, whether or not they needed to. Like, let's just see if there's an enhancement going on. I don't know. Maybe, again, this is probably like hashtag Uptown Problems. But just such, I think also the conversation, and when these books come out and they're so widely read, just discussing all of these issues that are so prevalent everywhere, anything that gets the dialogue started. And then, of course, this book, and you started talking about your friend Alan, and so can you talk a little bit about that, because I thought it was really fascinating.
This is a true story. I wrote about this in the New York Times Sunday Review when that first changed from the Weekend Review to the Sunday Review. They asked me to do this overview of whether antidepressants work. And I have a friend I call Alan in the writing who had a stroke, and it was a kind of stroke for which antidepressants have been shown to improve results, so that when people are put on Prozac early after the stroke, they get back better motor function and are better able to take care of themselves down the road. And this is a very dear friend, and I heard about the stroke a little late. A cousin of his called me, who also is a doctor, and we discussed it, and we thought, why is he not on Prozac, which, as it happens, was the medicine tested for this? I spoke to his neurologist, and the neurologist said, really, I've been reading that these medicines aren't much better than placebo, and they're only good for severe depression. And I thought to myself, hold on, when doctors who read seriously and so on are reluctant to give an antidepressant for an indication for which it, is really known to work with no evidence in the other direction, that notion that these medicines aren't effective has really gone too far. And I started thinking about my own practice and patients who'd come in who were on medicine and where the medicine had done remarkable things for them, where it had, saved their marriage and allowed them to progress in their career. And they'd be saying, I've read that these medicines are a little better than placebo. Should I come off? And I'd always say, I'm happy to discuss your coming off. I take people off antidepressants all the time, but not for that reason. So I went back. I started writing, as I say, first for the Times, and then I decided to do this book, and looked at the research that had given rise to the headlines, antidepressant lift may be all in your head, that kind of headline. These were all over the place. They were in USA Today and Newsweek and on 60 Minutes and even in the New York Times and New York Review of Books, and looked at that research, and it was really bad, questionable research. As I say, I wrote this book that introduces readers a little to research techniques. It goes back to the 1950s, says, where do these medicines come from? What do they do? And it happened that the research methods were also developed around mid-century, so that as the first antidepressants appeared, there were demands that they be tested under these new protocols. There were rating scales developed. So we kind of walked through what it is, what gives us confidence, scientific confidence that a medicine works. What are the outcomes for medicines across the board, for headache remedies, for asthma remedies, and so on, and how do the treatments in psychiatry compare to those? And I hope it's fun. I had fun doing it, and there are all these confounders, right? There are all these reasons why a research study can look good at first glance and turn out to be really unconvincing.
Sure.
So I take readers through that as well. And, my conclusion is these medicines are very well justified in the scientific literature. It's really clear that they work. And there are all kinds of reasons you might not want to take an antidepressant. They have side effects. You might prefer psychotherapy as an approach. You might prefer trying yoga and exercise and so on. But depression is a serious ailment.
I was going to say, you really can't warrior one depression away, but I mean, these enhance. I mean, so I think also the approach of doing many different things, and for me, reading Ordinarily Well, and I'm on the phone with Dr. Peter Kramer, The Case for Antidepressants, is out in paperback today, which is very exciting. And look up some of the articles; they're all fascinating. And all the ones you've cited, I remember reading in the paper because they're just, you write. I just love the way you write. It's so relatable and interesting, and it's comforting to hear because it would be really depressing to hear that you know what? After all this, I've concluded just do yoga and be mindful. But those things can enhance. But I really think it's so necessary for people to understand.
I mean, depression is harmful. It harms your bone elements, your hormonal glands, your blood elements. If the longer you're depressed, the more likely you are to be depressed down the road, the more complicated your later depressions may be. So really we want to interrupt it. And if something works for you, fine, God bless you. But if whatever you're trying that's around the margins doesn't work, psychotherapy and medication are really well tested. They work. And they work much better than even doctors think. I lectured on this around the country, really. And you say, if you have someone who has had a couple episodes of depression, this one is lingering, it looks serious, it's not getting better, and you as a doctor give any of these antidepressants, what are the odds a few months later that that person will no longer be depressed? You know, whether they recovered spontaneously, whether the medicine did the job, what are the odds they'll be better? And people give numbers like 30%. Well, the answer in the literature and in doctors' experience is, north of 75%.
Yeah,
probably.
That sounds really low, 30.
Right. I mean, people are just going to get better. And it's important for depressed people to know that because depressed people tend to be hopeless. They tend not to take action. And if you add to that the burden of casting them in doubt about whether treatment will work, you really end up with a situation where people don't get the help they need.
And that's really a very important takeaway, and really people need to get, I think that's something that's not talked about a lot, really. I don't think people really connect that.
I have this intermediate book, Against Depression.
Yeah, I read that one too. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I read them all, Peter.
The tendency to thank you, romanticize depression. And, the average depressed person is not a poet who's having trouble getting the first volume out. The average depressed person is a, single divorced mother who has not gotten as much education as she might have relative to her talents, has not had the job career she might have relative to her efforts, who's made bad choices in life. I mean, depression really interferes with our ability to function in the culture socially, and it's just very important to interrupt it as we would interrupt, diabetes.
Yes, and that's, again, the hope that the books that come out and the conversations that are relatable and available, I hope that somebody's listening right now says, you know what? It's time for me to take action about this. And you talked about that. You just described.
Even if you just look at these books, I'm sorry, and read this, read the vignettes, the stories, and say, that's me. Well,
that's the storyteller in you, and that's what's always connected me to your writing, really. And on Reading with Robin, I certainly cover a lot of fiction, but the nonfiction that I cover is something that I connect to, or so I feel important part of the dialogue. And again, that's why I can't believe we have not had an interview until just now.
But more often.
I know. What's the next book coming out? And also, you just mentioned that, which I'd love to know, but the woman that you just sort of described, single, divorced, didn't get to where she could have been relative to her talents. Is this Nora? You talked about the inspiration for the book. Is that the person?
I mean, I'm just saying that in general, that if you look kind of at who the modal depressed person is, who a typical depressed person is in the United States, that's really who it is. And a lot of the really thought-filled, heroic efforts in mental health care go toward taking these troubled mothers and giving them help so that there isn't this intergenerational transmission where the kids are going to be depressed as well.
Right.
Because that's some of the very good work that goes on by psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers.
That's where that goes on. I was just, as you were saying that, Mother's Little Helper sort of tuned into my head. That's
right.
where if I were at the radio station, I would have keyed in the music. But that's something, right, because that is, I know that I was reading somewhere about the inspiration for the book was Nora, so I didn't know if that was her profile.
Yeah, no, I think Nora's a more, probably more successful person. I think often people with depression do, it's known that people with melancholy over the years have less energy than other people, but use it very well. And, so certainly are depressed people who are very accomplished.
And not all poets looking to break out. And one other thing that I was thinking was interesting, certainly listening to Prozac coming out in 1993 and where we are today with Ordinarily Well, a major thing, of course, that's happened in that time period is social media, all of us being hyper-connected or yet thoroughly disconnected in some ways. Where do you equate mental health in that realm?
Yeah, I think social media has been helpful in that it's destigmatizing, it creates communities for people. I think it is harmful in that the, rare side effects and the strong complaints and the sort of anti-psychiatry movement all get very extensive forums so that you hear all kinds of things, see all kinds of things on the web that you wouldn't see very often in a doctor's office. So there's sort of good news, bad news. I do have a Twitter handle. I'm at Peter D. Kramer. And
good. Okay, thank you. Because I was looking, you're PeterDKramer.com, but
that's true. That's
but you don't really use it.
Okay. A half-dead website. but,
it might be north of that, Peter.
At Peter D. Kramer, and I've got a couple of Facebook. One as an author and one as a.
Yeah, where are you on Facebook? Okay, so you're on.
Also Peter D. Kramer and Peter D. Kramer author, and I do often tweet or post about recent research or books I think people should look at.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So you can find Peter on Twitter at Peter D. Kramer and on Facebook at Peter D. Kramer author, because people do like to check in, and I'll certainly tag this. And it's out today. It's Ordinarily Well, The Case for Antidepressants, out in paperback by Peter D. Kramer. And before I let you go, what are you reading this summer? I could say for fun, but just I don't know what your sense of summer reading is.
I read serious fiction for fun.
Cool.
My go-to author for a number of years, someone people may not have heard of, Javier Marias, M-A-R-I-A-S, with an accent on the I, who's one of the most popular Spanish Madrid-based authors. I don't think his latest book is his best, but anything he does is good. I've been reading the new Coetzee book, C-O-E-T-Z-E-E. He's American, South African, Australian, and he has a 2-book series that have the word Jesus in the title. They're not about Jesus. They're sort of minutes from now science fiction about an immigrant stepfather of a boy who, I guess in the book is sort of the Jesus figure, but it's just very smart philosophical writing in the form of a novel. So 2 recommendations.
Thank you. So a little light reading. I didn't think you were going to say, and the new John Grisham, but I just I always like to know because
I treasure my reading time, and as I say, it's from all over the world, but I like people who are pushing structural boundaries and are thinking about serious matters.
Well, I don't have them off the top of my head, but as you were saying those 2 titles, a few came into my mind, so I will send those over to you because you're right. I mean, the reading time is so precious. It's, how much time? So you're not going to start a book and just say, okay, I started it, I'm going to finish it. I know, I can't imagine you would ever do this. Do you?
I might.
Really?
I think I'm as prone to trash as the next person, but I try not to pick it up.
But there are people that will say, I'm not liking this. And I actually, you have your practice. And part of what I do as Reading with Robin and in my daily thing is I talk people off the ledge when they're reading a book that they don't want to finish, but they feel like they need to. Sure, there's some parallel diagnoses here.
Let me mention one more author, actually, who has a bit more of a mental health connection. Readers may know him. Edward St. Aubyn, A-U-B-Y-N, I think, has these Patrick Melrose novels. They're basically autobiographical, but they involve drug abuse and sexual child abuse, and I have to say they're funny, they're moving, they're clever. So you're reading about topics that are difficult to read about, and you're entirely engaged.
Well, right, and how important is humor in just life, of course.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
I don't know if you can assign that. I don't know, there were those books, The Happiness Quotient and all of this, but this is something really that's so meaningful. I mean, I don't know how one gets through the day without it, but that is something that can get lost, certainly, within, any kind of mental state where people are realizing. I think that's like such a great predictor. When was the last time you laughed? I don't know. There are people that just might find that's something they realize. I don't know if people even realize sometimes that they're in a depressed state.
Yes. No, I think that's right. The depression can be very convincing, so people think that's just the way the world is, that's just the way they are, they deserve it, they don't deserve any better. That's where friends and family come in, and someone has to really take you by the hand and say, look, this isn't the way we know you to be, and things can be different. Let's see if we can't get you some help.
Yeah, the people closest to you that you can trust, that's really key, is having the support and having people, it's a tricky thing, sometimes it's like, don't shoot the messenger, but it is have somebody in your life that you really need to be direct with, and it's life-saving. That's a great place to end, and I look forward to meeting you in person at some point, and very excited to share that Ordinarily Well, The Case for Antidepressants, out in paperback today. Peter Kramer, hope to see you around town.
Thank you.
Thanks for being on.